Hi, and welcome to another ArchDaily interview. Today, we are talking with Peter and Kuo, part of the team behind the project House of Dreams and winner of the 6th category of the UIA 2030 award, centered on utilizing local materials responding to the SDG 11. Both Peter and Kuo are architects and academics. They founded In-situ Project, a research by design platform that focuses on sustainable community development. Hi, Kuo. Hi, Peter. How are you?
Hi.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so let's just jump right into it. And can you please introduce yourself and tell us more about your background and about the team behind the project?
I'm Peter Hasdell. I'm an architect by training, also an urbanist. So I work a lot in, have worked a lot in unusual kind of circumstances in developing places, looking at processes of change. And about 2015, within School of Design in Hong Kong Polytechnic University, I wanted to set up a platform where we could work together with local communities, in this case, China initially, in a live way, basically like a kind of live laboratory where we would work together with the community. Very shortly after, then Kuo joined me, which was very good because I didn't speak Chinese and he does. He's architect as well. And basically since that time, we've worked with over 8 communities in China on more than 12 projects. We've realized perhaps about 8 or 9 of those projects in different locations across China and more recently in Iraq. So our ambition with that is actually to try to make a positive difference towards sustainable development with the community in three different ways. Social sustainability, economic sustainability, although we know not so much about that, and also environmental sustainability.
Thanks, Peter. So congrats on your win. You have been granted the award for your project House of Dreams. What can you tell us about the intervention and also about its very interesting context?
Yes, we had previously worked in other villages, as I mentioned, across China, in different types of villages. Some other ones are timber focused villages, other ones are just very ordinary rural construction, kind of typical across China. What combines all of them is somehow a sort of, all of the villages we worked in is a sort of lack of positive initiative. There may be the will in the community, but we really wanted to see if we could actually co-develop or develop, design and make together some of the projects. So round about, I think 2017, then Kuo also branched out and sought out the kind of cave location, which is Shaoshan in Henan province in China. He started working with that and then later on involved me in parts of that as well as our other team. And this was because this offered a kind of different challenge from, let's say, timber building or building above the earth. In this case, digging out the earth, which is, there are thousands and thousands of caves across the middle of China of different types. So for, I think, both myself and Kuo, this was a way to basically learn from a new context, work with a different kind of community, and then see how we could actually contribute to the sort of co-design of that place itself. Kuo, would you say that's a reasonable summary of how we started, or is there some other issue I missed?
I think general, yeah, you have summarized, and I'm just reading a bit of the question, maybe a bit of the background of why we enter or why we sort of learn and enjoy it. I think the context is, so you probably know, China has this sort of rural development approach in the last 10 years, right, as a whole country, and then we get to know some of these sort of community workers who are really trying to find a bottom-up way of doing community work, because in the whole development, I think the one suffers are the community, right? They don't get resources. So with this sort of background, Peter and I sort of very interested in see how architecture can contribute differently. So we sort of enter a little bit like a community worker architect's point of view. And I think that's a sort of trying to find way, sort of see how architecture can contribute socially, sustainably, right? Economically, technically. So this is something we look how we join. So I hope this is clear, but do ask more questions, Emily.
If I may say, usually our normal way of working is we work with locally based organization. They can be social worker or NGO, or in the case of the Zhaoshan project, a really amazing elderly lady, retired school teacher who moved to this village 20 years ago and worked with the elderly population there, the villagers there, doing mostly socially oriented programs. So when we came along, it's quite late. She's already been there 18 or so years, but she really sort of I don't want to say reprogram, revitalized the community towards a sort of very positive direction. And she is really the kind of glue of this project. Her name is Lian Laoshi, or Lian Jun, Laoshi's teacher. And the community group that she runs there is called the Zhaoshan Community Group, who were also instrumental in enabling us to work together with them and another professor who was looking at solidarity economy or circular economy called Dr. Ku Hop Ban. So between our three kind of main collaborators, then we were able to sort of look at this project in a quite unique way, we feel.
So a lot of people were involved in the process and in the project, of course, with the community. Before we start talking about the community, because I feel like we have a lot to say there, let's discuss a bit local materials, because they were at the center of the design process. So can you tell us a bit more about it?
Cool. Kuo, do you want to jump in there?
Sure. I think local material was sort of, it presents itself as necessary, right? It wasn't the choice of architecture design. It was just the fact that we're doing community work. We're trying to find the most economical way as the first most fundamental point. So, and of course, we do believe in we can solve things locally. So that's how we started, from budget reason, but also from the sort of ideological reason that we think we should start trying to build more with local material. So that's how it all started. And but then from an architectural point of view, we also begin to think maybe if we can develop more type of material, not just sort of so-called traditional local material is a natural material, but here we try sort of people's waste, we turn it into material, leftover material has been there for 30, 40 years, or even, you know, China is in huge development, and in development there's leftover surplus material. So we're trying to, of course, we ask the community to if we can collect them. And so it become not just sort of material as a design language, but really become a way of using material to understand how wealthy we are and how we can sort of see architecture as material economy, right? So this is sort of idea behind. And I think most powerful thing is that these are material collected by the local, right? They drive a truck and they go around the houses, they go around the town, and they suddenly realizing how much they have, right? And then now even though during the pandemic we are less involved, then they begin to collect things that we don't know. They go to next neighbor, next villages. So I think it has this whole thing of using material, not just architecture, but as a sort of culture, economy, as an identity. I think it starts to spread around. So it's quite powerful as a way of doing architecture by seeing like an economy, I think.
If I may add to that, sorry.
No,
if I may add to that, one of the things we tried in another village was doing zero money projects. In other words, we had no resource, so we wanted to make a square or community kitchen. So we have no money for material, no money for builder. So basically that means that then if the village wants that, we have to source all the material from found materials or stones from the river or stones from something demolished or something like this. So we were able on a smaller scale to successfully test a few of those and then engage a huge number of the community involved in co-making that, not just donating the materials, but also co-making that. So when we got to Shaoshan village, in the beginning, when we tried to initiate this process, there's some resistance because in China, then most people, including villagers, want something new, shiny, new materials and so forth. But once we can overcome the resistance by the people making it, by the builders, by the local people who live in the village, then suddenly they can see, oh, this is quite meaningful because this stones, this roof tiles, these windows, they come from my grandmother's house or my uncle's house or something like this. And it has a kind of meaning for them, as well as a kind of pride in how they put that together. It tells a little story, if you like, of something like this. So there's certain kind of testing we did, but also certain application on a bigger scale in the House of Dreams.
And I was going to say that you basically also put in place some sort of new habits for the villagers, since they started also collecting these so-called wastes and to use them also in other ways as materials, or also, as Kuo said, like they started acknowledging what kind of wealth they have. So do you think this is why this project was selected for this particular award?
I think so. I mean, there's many different aspects to the project. Some materials are actually made by the villagers who are mostly elderly. Actually, the sort of the working age people left the village a long time ago, so it leaves behind retired people, 70 odd, age 70 or 65 or above. So to see that and see also the large number of elderly women also involved in the construction of the project voluntarily, it's not by coercion, was quite astonishing, right? Because once they were committed to the project, they really understood this. And then the material issue also extended to preservation, for instance, of all the trees on the site. So try to not demolish any natural resources. So the sort of circular material use or the recycling of material, the sort of repurposing of this old abandoned caves, which is the caves of their childhood memories, was quite powerful on, I think, many levels for them. It's not like we are the architect, we just come in and design everything. We design the process and the way that can enable this. I think that, but the actual outcome comes from kind of collective spirit rather than individual designers, if you like. Hopefully that's been evident for the UIA and the SDG, UI 2030 judges. I hope so anyway, or they've certainly recognized something in that, and we're very happy for that.
And speaking of the community, yes, tell us, Kuo. Please go ahead.
I just want to share a bit of observation, Peter, about, I mean, also been reflecting, we all been reflecting about this. I think if this sort of approach is relevant nowadays, I don't think the people we work with, the community we work with, they see they are willing to do it. It's not because they see this is sustainable or they see this is ecological. And I think maybe we need to discuss architecture profession need to also introduce another social way of looking at how this kind of encouraging material development is possible. Not just say how good this is good for the nature, but I think people are willing to donate, people are willing to collect, and people are willing to build like this. I think it's because they have pleasure in it. They are donating, so they are giving. So they feel when they give, they are part of it. So I think there's more sort of cultural and social reason in order to push the kind of sustainable development. It's not just all about numbers and technical number, how well we reduce CO2, but it's really, I think, underneath that, we need to go back to human level, that in order to push this kind of way forward, we need to see the social context in the material, right? Like what we were talking about, the wealth, about Peter was talking about the story in the material. I think this is something quite not many people talk about, right now in architectural profession, and how does one utilize that in order to have final sentence, to have further spread, is really when you reach the heart of the people, rather than talking about how well we reduce the CO2. But then, of course, it then turn into CO2 reduction, right? So it's from this sort of narrative angle, social angle, cultural angle, I think it's important to reinforce. And I do think there's possibly, Peter, I do think there's possibly we are somehow out of being selected, because it's a little bit unusual compared to those competitors, which are fantastic projects. But I think there's a different angle in House of Dream, sorry, repeating myself.
No, please continue. And probably this is what it is, the human aspect that is so central to everything that you are basically doing in House of Dreams, if that makes sense. So speaking of
I think also the think also enabling the population, the community, and not just this one village in China, but all across, let's say, the developing world is very, very important, because otherwise sustainability becomes like the domain of United Nations, or wealthy governments, or resource-rich companies that provide materials, provide technical solutions. So it is cultural, has to be cultural, has to be sort of rooted in the community practices. And these things, I think if you look back, I don't know, 1,000 years, you can see that perhaps farmers all around the world, or people living in villages, were quite sustainable, self-sufficient, resilient, but not perhaps today. So trying to find ways that they can actually be sustainable in limited cases, like the House of Dreams, to test out things, test out their ways that they can actually try these things, the ways they can get new skill, but also individual pride or community pride in these things is quite important. But I think that's the cultural and social thing that Guo is talking about.
And how did it actually start with the community? Because you talked about how you engaged the community throughout the project and after the project also, but how did it start? How were you able to really implicate this relatively older community?
Typically within the communities, Guo can talk more on Zhaoshan, but the way we do this is through a kind of participatory process, or co-design or co-construction process. So we don't come in as the people knowing all the answers, but come in as willing to work together with them. For Zhaoshan, then there may be specifically a few differences in how you started. Was that right, Guo? Your starting point was somewhat different to that. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I just add, and we just sort of ping pong back and forth. I think the question how one this has been always a question, how one really able to work with community, right? And co-design, participatory design, Peter talked about, and we know nowadays everybody talking about social design, but how does one really sort of manage to enter and really become a partnership with the community? Of course, we are lucky to be able to work with social worker, community worker. They are already rooted there. But I think there's a deeper sense to that when we to think, why will the community willing to accept you, right? It's very difficult. I mean, you're trying to start a project, and how would they accept you? And how can they accept you for 3 years, 4 years? Maybe they can accept you for 1 month, right? But they get fed up. So I think there's a reason behind, and recently been reflecting, and I think it's because they are feeling unfairly treated, right? They're feeling unfairly treated. They're feeling injustice in the environment, in the way they live. So I think the way in situ work has been sort of following what Peter said, co-design, participatory design. But it's not just let's talk about the project. I think it's really get to become a friendship with them, get to know them. So the role of architect is not the traditional way of architect. We have become more like a friend, worker, collaborator, very honest, commenting each other's mistake, willing to accept mistakes. So I think this sort of new form of relationship that I think in situ very open to accept. Also, it's an academia sort of background, so we are more approaching like a research, educational. So I think people tend to be easier to accept we as an outsider. And I think because it's different from the mainstream way of approach, I think there is an element of willing to listen. And I think this willing to listen is very lacking nowadays. And so I think participatory design, in fact, has a social justice behind that. They feel unjust. So this sort of design process reflecting on what's the justice, right? And I think that's how you share the friendship, and how you can make what your question is, how can one implement this kind of design project in community, is because of this openness and willing to accept and willing to share. I think that's how one can do it.
I think it's also important to mention that quite often some of the people we work with, our assistants or our project, people helping our projects, they will go and live in the village or spend quite a lot of time. So another village, for instance, one of our assistants actually lived in the village for 6 months, a different village. In this particular one, then there were periods where our assistant basically lived together with the villagers in this to really help certain kind of parts of the process to work together with the village to make sure that they would really happen. And the villagers also accepted that guy at the time very, very much. So this is also part of our in-situ or on-site, insight approach, working very locally.
So after the House of Dreams, what other projects you are working on in China and other places around the world? You already mentioned you had a project in Iraq. So can you tell us about how you actually implement, let's say, this approach around the world, the in-situ approach?
Yes, China has been our testing ground for these things, and some projects are ongoing. So even House of Dreams, although nothing is confirmed yet, but there is a wish. We've actually started on a new stage of this, and then the hope is that this turns into a kind of open school or place where other villagers can go and then learn together with the Zhaoshan village community. So it would be a certain kind of new kind of rural school where they can experiment with different approaches and share and exchange knowledge. So there's a few stages for that. The House of Dreams. One is to develop a kind of community hall, underground buried community hall for over 100 people, and then possibly a future stage develop this whole facility into a kind of new kind of school. Of course, this is sensitive issue, so we don't know these issues yet, whether that's actually possible, whether the funding is there, and so on. We are also, within China, we are working on trying to make parts of our approach into some kind of guidelines that we can share with other like-minded people who want to work in similar contexts. So this is trying to use our experience to come up with a series of tools or guidelines for other people to work, if they're doing something similar, if they're architect, designer, or social work, and they want to engage in some kind of physical transformation of part of the environment. This, we hope, will turn into a book in about a year's time, or at least a web-based series of guidelines. For Iraq project, that is a refugee center, community center, health center, together with Habibi organization, which is a US-based organization of doctors and dentists and health workers. For the Bursif refugee camp, it's for the some of the Kurdish refugees who are stuck on the Turkish border in northern Iraq. And they've been there 10 years or so in a very inhospitable place. And then we were approached in a slightly different way because we have to do this remote. It's in COVID times. We could not travel to Iraq, but we work with very, very good NGOs who work with the Bursif camp. And then in this case, we did much more sort of design process where we identified one part of the building that actually could be used for training up new skills with the local community who are otherwise unemployed and rather dejected. So by enabling them with some kind of new construction skills, I believe they were paid a small amount of money, but then this perhaps can trigger certain approaches whereby they may be able to control their own environment, build their own houses or homes. What we used was something called super adobe, which is adobe, but basically placed in long plastic bags and then stacked up and rendered over. So we choose one particular building that we can make a kind of case study for that, and then can be used to try to spread out that kind of knowledge to the wider refugee community in that place. But that's almost finished, should be finished in 3 or 4 months' time. That's where we are at the moment. So, we are also looking for other approaches because, or other locations, and we would be happy to work in those locations if we can find similar sort of like-minded approaches and people that we can work together with.
Thanks, Peter. And finally, my last question for you is, why do you think it's important for architects to engage with the SDGs?
From architects, professional-based architects, there's many discussions, as I'm sure you know very well. But for architects involved in, let's say, the developing world, which is, I don't know, the 2/3 or 3/4 of the world who do not have access to architects and architecture. This is probably much bigger than if you're engaging in a wealthy city in Germany that has the resources and technological capacity to meet the SDGs under government rubrics and so forth. But if you're in a sort of very impoverished part of the world, it requires a different way of thinking. And there are some very good architects out there who are beginning to think like this. And for In-situ Project, this is just our our steps towards trying to rethink how we can engage with a sort of more sustainable development approach that is not necessarily top down, it's really bottom up and engaging community, local materials, circular material economies, and so forth. Kuo, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I mean, lots of reflection on these questions open up so many. I mean, maybe from this conversation, from how one respond to this competition or this award or these sustainable development goals, I do think I'd like to share some thought. Maybe what one can sort of share from In-situ's approach is maybe we need to reflect. Maybe there are different way of practicing architecture. Maybe it's not sort of commission and investor sort of driving force, but maybe we architects can be activists, right? Can initiate project. Of course, there's a financial issue, but we do need to find our way that we don't need to serve somehow, right? The capital, but we can serve community with this kind of engagement project. I do think we get to expand architecture's practice in this way. So maybe we also need to adjust our role or our ego as architect and our technique and our skill. Like when we talk about material as an economy, right? Suddenly we become sort of economist. Suddenly we become a sort of community worker, right? And I do think this sort of sustainable development goals, we could, I think it's important to engage, but I think somehow there's a danger when we enter only in a technical and quantitative sort of approach. I do find it dangerous because then it's also leading to large development, right? When you start quantitative, it's another top-down development, then the problem is still there. The social problem is still there. So this is my response sideways towards your question I'd like to share.
Thanks, Kuo. Would you like to add anything else, Peter, Kuo?
Just the In-situ project is, we start out as a kind of experiment, like a lab approach, right? Looking at how can we work with live, real people, real context, real material, real site, real issue. We can't answer all of their problem, but we can work together on ones they choose with us. Through that process, we learn, we build up knowledge, experience, capability, and then slowly sort of work out what's our particular approach towards, for instance, sustainable development goals, SDGs, or circular material economy, but not in a sort of European context or North American context, but in a sort of alternative process. So hopefully that as we continue to evolve, we can also contribute further things towards this approach. And then House of Dreams perhaps is the starting point or one of the sort of realized initial projects for us, but that can lead on towards other things.
Cool, last thoughts.
Yeah, I like to use this ArchDaily platform and this UIA platform to invite more architects to this project, House of Dreams. As Peter said, the idea is turned into a shared training and idea exploration ground. And there is so a little bit of advertisement. There's a place to sleep, there's a place to eat, local food, there's plenty of local material, plenty of community masters. And it is a ground that I think is quite unique, that for architecture, architect to test ideas, not in the lab, but in the site, but also with real people, with real problems. So I like to use this platform to invite more people to join this project and to co-create together. It's not that far, a few hours of flight, and it's 1 hour from the airport. That's all for my last sentence.
Yes.
Thank you for both of you. And we actually invite them also to check your project and to check In-situ's approaches and interventions also, and to go also to House of Dreams.
Thank you
Thanks
so much.
to both of you.
It's really great.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.